My wife didn't know. I was a boss and told me to leave the moment she found out. Her life fell apart. You won't believe what happened to me. One day, my wife told me I'd never make it without her. What she didn't know is that I'd been hiding a massive secret. As soon as she found out who I really was, her world came crashing down. Stay with me, because this story of betrayal, revenge, and shocking truth will leave you stunned. I still remember the first time I saw her, Madeline, with that radiant smile and an air of confidence that could have lit up the whole room. Back then, she was everything I thought I wanted. We met at a friend's barbecue on one of those sticky summer afternoons in Texas. I was standing by the grill, nursing a cold beer, when she walked in wearing this sundress that seemed to float around her. She wasn't just beautiful. She had a way of holding herself, like the world bent to her will. Before I knew it, we were talking, laughing, and by the end of the night, I'd somehow gathered enough courage to ask her out. She said yes, and that single word started what I thought would be the rest of my life. We moved fast. Within a year, we were married. I'd always been more reserved, steady job, small group of friends, a guy who found joy in quiet accomplishments rather than grand gestures. Madeline, on the other hand, was fire in motion. She had big dreams, talked about traveling the world, starting her own business, making a name for herself. In the early days, I admired her drive. It balanced my more cautious nature, or so I thought. Together, we seemed like the perfect team. Her ambition paired with my dependability. I felt lucky, like I'd found someone who saw something in me even I didn't fully see. But over the years, something shifted. At first, it was subtle. She started making these little comments. Harmless at first, I told myself. John, you always order the same thing. Don't you want to try something different for once? Harmless. Then it was. You never take risks. I wish you'd just loosen up a bit. That one stung, but I let it slide. I loved her, after all, and marriage meant compromise, right? I figured she was just stressed. I figured once her career took off, once she got what she was striving for, she'd be happy again, and things would go back to the way they were. I was wrong. By the 5th year of our marriage, the comments had turned into something sharper. She'd look at me, shaking her head, her tone laced with disappointment. Do you even care about where we're going, John? I feel like I'm pulling all the weight in this marriage. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just another rough patch. But the words started to stick. Every glance, every sigh, every time she compared me to someone else's husband. Emma's husband just got promoted again. Can you believe it? They chipped away at me. I started to dread the sound of her voice, the look in her eyes when I'd walk through the door after work. She didn't see the man who'd built a steady career, who'd saved enough to keep us comfortable even if things went south. She only saw what I wasn't. I guess the hardest part wasn't the words, though. It was the silence. The moments when she'd glance at me like I was a stranger. The nights when I'd come home to find her scrolling through her phone, barely glancing up as I walked in. I'd cook dinner, set the table, try to start a conversation, but her responses were always curt, distracted. Sure. Whatever you think. It was like being married to a ghost, a woman who had once laughed at my jokes, who'd reached for my hand in the middle of a crowded room. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who looked right through me. And yet, I stayed. I stayed because I thought love was supposed to endure. I stayed because I believed in vows and promises. I stayed because I kept telling myself that the woman I married was still in there somewhere. That if I just waited long enough, worked hard enough, loved her enough, she'd come back. So I smiled through the barbed remarks. I nodded when she told me I wasn't ambitious enough, that I should do more, be more. I swallowed my pride every time she sighed in exasperation, every time she rolled her eyes when I suggested a vacation spot, or brought up something I was excited about. I told myself that patience was strength, that holding on was noble. But it wasn't. It was surrender. I just didn't know it yet. The breaking point came on a night like any other. I'd had a long day at the office, juggling deadlines and meetings. But I was still looking forward to coming home, hoping maybe tonight would be different. As I walked through the door, Madeline stood in the kitchen, arms crossed. Her expression was a mixture of irritation and disbelief. Are you really just going to sit there all night again? She snapped. Do you ever take initiative, John? Do you even have any idea how tired I am of doing everything myself? I felt my chest tighten, the weight of her words pressing down like a lead blanket. I tried to respond calmly, but she cut me off. You wouldn't survive a week without me. Honestly, sometimes I think you just enjoy being useless. I don't know what changed in me at that moment, but something did. Maybe it was the way she laughed afterward, shaking her head as if the idea of me being more than I appeared was a joke. Maybe it was the certainty in her voice, the way she said it as if it were a universal truth. I met her gaze, my own steady, unflinching. Is that what you think? I asked quietly. That I wouldn't survive without you? She didn't hesitate. That's exactly what I think, she said, her confidence unshaken. That was it. That was the moment. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, her voice trailing after me as I went to the bedroom. I pulled a suitcase from the closet, methodically packing the essentials. She followed, still talking, still trying to assert her dominance. Jonathan, stop being ridiculous. You're not serious. I zipped the suitcase shut and turned to her one last time. Let's find out, I said simply. I walked past her, out of the bedroom, out of the house. Each step felt lighter than the last. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. It's strange how one moment can change everything. That night, when she said those words, you wouldn't survive without me, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was more like a slow, spreading clarity, like a light finally cutting through a fog that had been there for years. I stood there for a long moment, her voice still ringing in my ears, her certainty as unshakable as if it were etched in stone. She believed it. She really, truly believed that I couldn't make it without her, that I was somehow incapable of standing on my own. And that's when I realized that she didn't just underestimate me. She had no idea who I really was. Madeline had spent so long constructing her version of me, the safe, predictable husband, the man who would never take risks, who would never leave, that she'd convinced herself. It was the truth. But that night, I knew better. I wasn't the man she thought I was. I hadn't been for a long time. And as I walked away, suitcase in hand, I felt something that had been missing for years: resolve. I was done proving myself to someone who refused to see me for who I was. Leaving wasn't easy. I wish I could say it was, but the truth is, every step felt heavier than the last. There were moments when I almost turned back, almost let her words pull me back into the same cycle. The house behind me, our house, was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner. For years, it had been my refuge, the place I returned to after long days at work. But now, as I walked out that door, it felt like a cage I was finally escaping. The air outside was cool and crisp, and for a moment, I just stood there on the driveway, taking it in. It was late, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. The suitcase felt heavy in my hand, not just from the clothes and belongings inside, but from the weight of what I was leaving behind. I drove for hours that night, not really knowing where I was going. The roads were nearly empty, the city lights eventually giving way to long stretches of highway. I had no plan, no destination. I just needed to keep moving. I rolled down the window, letting the cold air wash over me, keeping me awake and alert. My phone buzzed constantly in the passenger seat, her name lighting up the screen again and again. I didn't answer. I didn't even look at the messages. I already knew what they would say: demands, accusations, maybe even a half-hearted apology. But I wasn't interested in hearing it. Not anymore. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a small motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just a row of rooms with faded numbers on the doors, and a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. The clerk behind the counter didn't ask any questions, and I didn't offer any answers. I paid in cash, took the key, and carried my suitcase inside. The room was sparse, a bed with a lumpy mattress, a wooden chair, and a small television bolted to the wall. It smelled faintly of mildew and cheap air freshener, but it was quiet. That was all I needed. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pattern on the worn carpet. For the first time that night, the weight of everything hit me. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to make it work, the countless times I'd swallowed my pride, held my tongue, convinced myself that things would get better. I thought about all the little moments that had led up to this, the dismissive comments, the cold looks, The way she'd brush me off like I didn't matter. And then I thought about her words that night, the way she'd laughed, so certain that I would never leave. You wouldn't survive without me. I could still hear the smugness in her voice, the absolute confidence that I was nothing without her. I clenched my hands into fists, my nails digging into my palms. For years, I had let her shape the narrative of who I was, let her diminish me piece by piece. But not anymore. She didn't get to define me, not now. Not ever again. The next morning, I woke up before the sun rose. The motel room was cold, the thin curtains barely blocking out the faint light of dawn. I took a quick shower, the water lukewarm at best, and changed into a fresh shirt and jeans. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize the man staring back. I looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen myself, but there was something else there too. A glimmer of determination, maybe. A hint of the man I used to be before everything got so complicated. I packed my bag, checked out of the motel, and got back on the road. I spent the next few days driving aimlessly, staying in cheap motels and eating at roadside diners. Each morning, I'd sit at the counter with a cup of coffee, listening to the chatter of truck drivers and locals. People who didn't know me or my story. It was strange, being anonymous like that. For so long, my life had been defined by the roles I played: husband, provider, the steady one who always kept things together. But now, I was just a man on the road, trying to figure out what came next. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had room to breathe. Of course, she didn't make it easy. The calls and messages didn't stop. Every time I checked my phone, there were more. At first, they were angry. How dare you just leave like that? You're being childish, Jonathan. You'll regret this. Then they shifted, turning softer, more pleading. Can we just talk about this? You're overreacting. Come home so we can fix this. I didn't mean what I said, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. She was playing the same games she always did, trying to guilt me, manipulate me, pull me back into the cycle I'd finally broken free from. I wasn't going to let her do that to me again. One night, after another long day on the road, I checked into a motel just outside Amarillo. It was late, and I was exhausted, my body aching from hours behind the wheel. I threw my bag on the bed and collapsed into the chair by the window. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I stared out at the dark parking lot, lit only by a single flickering street lamp. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. I reached for it, hesitated, then picked it up. Another message from her. I'm sorry. Please just call me so we can talk. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the delete button. For a moment, I considered calling her back, just to hear her voice. Just to see if maybe, just maybe, she really was sorry this time. But then I thought about the years of hurt, the countless times I'd hoped things would change. And I put the phone down. Some things couldn't be undone. Some wounds were too deep to heal with a simple apology. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led me to this point. I thought about the man I used to be, the man I wanted to become again. I thought about what I wanted my life to look like from here on out, what I needed to do to rebuild, to find myself again. And as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet, but I knew one thing for sure: I was never going back. Now that you know how it started, I have to ask, do you think she's going to beg for forgiveness, or will she try to destroy me completely? Comment 11 if you think she'll come crawling back, or comment woo 22 if you think she'll go full scorched earth. I'm curious to see what you predict. It's hard to describe what those first few weeks felt like after I walked away. On the surface, it seemed like I had finally found freedom. I was no longer under the same roof as Madeline, no longer subject to her constant jabs, her dismissive glances, her sighs of exasperation whenever I so much as opened my mouth. But freedom wasn't immediate. It wasn't like flipping a switch and suddenly everything was better. No, it was more like learning how to walk again after years of limping. At first, every step felt unsure, every decision weighed down by the echoes of her words. You can't do it, Jonathan. You wouldn't survive without me. Those phrases lingered, not just as memories, but as something deeper, doubts I'd been carrying around for years. I had internalized them, let them shape how I saw myself. And now that I was on my own, Those doubts didn't disappear. They whispered to me at night when the world was quiet. They crept into my thoughts when I stared at the unfamiliar ceiling of a cheap motel room. But as the days turned into weeks, I started to feel something else. It was faint at first, like the warmth of the sun on a cold day. A sense that I could do this. That maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong all along. At first, it was the small things. I remember walking into a grocery store one afternoon, pushing a cart down aisles filled with cereal boxes and canned soups, and realizing I had no one to answer to. For years, every trip like this had been accompanied by a running commentary in my head. Would Madeline approve of what I was buying? Would she roll her eyes if I picked up the wrong brand of coffee, or bought the generic paper towels? It sounds ridiculous, but that's how it had been. I'd let her voice live rent-free in my mind. But that day, standing in the middle of that store, it hit me. I didn't have to care anymore. If I wanted to buy the cheap coffee, or the extra pack of chips, or the $2 greeting cards I never actually sent, I could. I remember standing there, holding a jar of peanut butter, and smiling like an idiot. It was such a small thing, choosing what I wanted, without fear of judgment, but it felt monumental. Then there were the conversations. For years, I'd stopped speaking my mind. Madeline had a way of shutting me down, making me feel like my thoughts weren't worth sharing. Even when we were with friends, I'd learned to keep my opinions to myself, afraid that she'd cut me off or correct me in front of everyone. But now, with her out of the picture, I started to find my voice again. It wasn't easy at first. I still felt that hesitation, that second guessing that had become second nature. But I forced myself to push past it. I started having real conversations with people, strangers at diners, old friends I hadn't seen in years, even the clerk at the gas station who always had some random trivia to share. Slowly, I realized that I could be myself again. I didn't have to play the role of the quiet husband, the safe and predictable guy who never made waves. I could speak freely, laugh at my own jokes, and have the kind of genuine, unscripted interactions that had been missing from my life for so long. Work was another area where I began to see change. I'd always been good at what I did, leading a team, solving complex problems, making decisions under pressure. But at home, that side of me had been invisible. Madeline never asked about my day, never wanted to hear about the deals I closed or the projects I managed. To her, my job was just a boring office gig, something I did to pay the bills. But now, I started to take pride in my work again. I stayed late when I needed to, not because I was trying to escape home, but because I genuinely wanted to excel. I found myself volunteering for bigger projects, taking on responsibilities that challenged me. And with each success, my confidence grew. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need anyone's approval. I could stand on my own, and I could thrive. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were days when the loneliness hit hard, when I missed the idea of having someone to come home to. But then I'd remind myself that what I'd left behind wasn't really a partnership. It wasn't love. It was control, manipulation, and a constant reminder that I wasn't enough. Now, when I walked through the door of my small apartment, it was quiet. It was simple. And it was mine. That realization alone was worth every moment of doubt, every lonely night, every second of uncertainty. I wasn't just surviving, I was beginning to rebuild. The messages started small at first. 1 or 2 a day. They were polite, cordial, even asking if I was okay, if I'd had enough time to think things through. She would write things like, "I know you're still mad, but we should talk," or, "Just call me when you're ready, no pressure." I could almost hear her voice as I read them. That practiced tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. The tone that always made it seem like she was the one who had been wronged, and I was just being stubborn. For the first few days, I didn't reply. I told myself it was best to let it sit, to give her time to calm down and maybe reflect on her own behavior. But as the silence stretched out, the messages started to change. The calm, measured words turned sharp. "Are you seriously ignoring me?" she wrote one morning. "I can't believe how childish you're being. I thought you were better than this, Jonathan." I read the message twice, then put my phone down without replying. What was there to say? I knew her tactics. I'd lived with them for years. The escalation didn't stop there. By the second week, the messages were coming in rapid fire bursts. Some were apologetic, half-hearted attempts at reconciliation. I didn't mean what I said. I was frustrated. You know, I don't really think that about you. Others were angry, demanding that I come home so we could talk this out like adults. And then there were the guilt trips. The ones that hit a little too close to the old insecurities. She'd spent years planning in me. So you're just going to throw everything away? After all we've been through? She wrote one night. I thought you were stronger than this. I guess I was wrong. That one stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd spent so many years trying to prove her wrong. Trying to show her that I was strong, capable, worthy of her respect. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Now, even after I'd left, she was still trying to push that same button. The phone calls started shortly after that. She'd call at all hours early in the morning, late at night, leaving voicemails that ranged from calm and collected to barely controlled rage. One morning, I woke up to a string of missed calls and a voicemail that began with, "Jonathan, this is ridiculous. Pick up the phone." Her voice was steady at first, but as the message went on, I could hear her patience unraveling. "You think you're punishing me, but you're just hurting yourself. We both know you're not cut out for this. Just come home so we can figure this out." I deleted it, without listening to the rest. I didn't need to hear her tell me, once again, that I couldn't make it on my own. I knew what she was doing. This wasn't about love, or reconciliation, or even closure. It was about control. She wasn't reaching out because she missed me. She was reaching out because she couldn't stand the thought that I'd taken control of my own life. For years, she had held the power in our relationship. She decided what we did, where we went, how we spent our time, and I'd let her. I thought that's what a good husband was supposed to do, keep the peace, let her have her way, make sure she was happy. But it had never been about making her happy. It had always been about keeping her in control. And now that I'd finally broken free, she didn't know how to handle it. So she did what she always did. She tried to manipulate me, to guilt me into coming back. But this time, I wasn't playing along. I started to dread the sound of my phone buzzing. Every time it lit up with her name, I felt that old familiar knot in my stomach. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a kind of reflexive anxiety, like a Pavlovian response after years of walking on eggshells. I had to remind myself, over and over, that she didn't have power over me anymore. I didn't have to answer. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't owe her anything. Still, the weight of those messages lingered. Each one a small reminder of the person she'd convinced me I was. Every time I thought I was moving forward, her words would pull me back, like a rope tied around my chest, yanking me back toward the life I'd left behind. Eventually, I decided to block her number. It wasn't an easy decision. Part of me felt like I was taking the coward's way out, like I was running from the confrontation I'd been avoiding for years. But another part of me knew it was the only way to truly move on. As long as her messages kept coming, as long as her voice filled my voicemail inbox, I couldn't escape the cycle we'd been trapped in for so long. Blocking her number felt like cutting the last thread that tied me to the person I used to be. When I finally did it, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I knew I wouldn't have to see her name pop up on my screen anymore. Sadness because, in some small way, it felt like the end of something I'd spent so many years trying to fix. In the days that followed, I started to feel lighter. The constant buzzing of my phone had been replaced by silence, and with it came a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I started focusing on the little things, getting back into a routine, taking care of myself, rebuilding the parts of my life I'd neglected for so long. I went to the gym, something I hadn't done in years. I took long walks in the evenings, letting the fresh air clear my mind. I cooked meals I actually enjoyed, not just the ones I thought she'd approve of. Little by little, I felt more like myself again. But the thing about breaking free from someone like Madeline is that it's never really over. Even with her number blocked, I knew she wasn't done. She wasn't the kind of person who let go easily. She thrived on control, on having the upper hand, and she wasn't going to give that up without a fight. I could feel it in the back of my mind, a nagging sense that she was still out there, plotting her next move. I didn't know what form it would take. Maybe she'd show up at my work. Maybe she'd start calling our mutual friends, trying to turn them against me. I didn't know, but I knew it was coming. And I knew I had to be ready, because no matter what she tried, no matter how many times she pushed, I wasn't going back. I had fought too hard to leave, and I wasn't about to let her pull me back into the life I'd finally left behind. Once her direct calls stopped working, she began reaching out through other channels. I'd already blocked her number, but I started getting emails instead, some coming directly from her, others through what must have been a new account she set up. It didn't take long for her messages to pop up in my inbox like clockwork, each one more dramatic than the last. I made the mistake of reading a couple at first. The first one was a long-winded plea, full of phrases like, "You're making a huge mistake," and "I only said those things because I was under so much stress." The second email was harsher, flipping the tone entirely. She accused me of being a coward, of running away instead of facing the truth about our relationship. She wrote, "It's funny how you can just cut me off like this. Like I never mattered. I guess that's who you really are, Jonathan." I stopped reading after that. I didn't need to see more of the same guilt-tripping, gaslighting nonsense I'd dealt with for years. Deleting the messages became a ritual. Each time her name appeared in my inbox, I'd hover over it just long enough to confirm it was another one of her attempts to pull me back. Then I'd click delete and move on. At first, it felt like a small act of rebellion. Over time, it became second nature. But she wasn't done. I should have expected it, really. She was never the type to give up easily. And when one approach didn't work, she found another. I started hearing from mutual friends, people I hadn't spoken to in months, some even years. They'd call out of the blue, their voices full of hesitation. "Hey, John. So, I ran into Madeline the other day." Or, "I just wanted to check in. I heard from Madeline that things have been, well, rough." The first few calls caught me off guard. I'd find myself fumbling for a response, unsure how much these friends already knew, or how much she had told them. But as more of these calls came in, a pattern started to emerge. She wasn't just reaching out to them. She was spinning her version of events, carefully crafting a narrative where I was the one at fault, the one who'd abandoned her without cause. It was infuriating. These were people who had known us as a couple, who had seen us at barbecues and dinner parties, who had once told me they admired how steady I was, how well I supported her ambitions. Now, they were hearing a different story, a story where I was the selfish husband who couldn't handle her success, who walked away because I didn't want to grow up. I could tell some of them believed her. A few dropped subtle hints, asking if I'd considered seeing a therapist, or if maybe I should just talk to her one more time to clear the air. But others seemed genuinely curious, wanting to hear my side. I didn't give them much. We had our issues, I'd say. It just wasn't working out. I wasn't about to start defending myself, or airing all our dirty laundry, to people who didn't know the full story. She could play her games. I wasn't going to play along. Still, it wasn't easy hearing her version of me reflected back from people I considered friends. Every time I got one of those calls or messages, I'd have to remind myself that they didn't know the whole truth. I'd tell myself that her lies didn't change who I really was. But that didn't stop the frustration from creeping in. I found myself replaying old arguments in my head, thinking about all the times I'd let her words slide, all the times I'd stayed silent when I should have spoken up. She had always been good at controlling the narrative, at making herself look like the victim while casting me as the villain. I'd seen her do it to others, friends, colleagues, and now I was her target. It was exhausting. But as frustrating as it was, it also reinforced why I'd left. This was exactly what I'd been trying to escape. The manipulation, the control, the constant battle to prove myself against her skewed version of reality. I wasn't going to let her drag me back into that. I couldn't. Over time, the calls from friends began to taper off. Maybe they realized they weren't getting the reaction Madeline hoped for. Maybe they got tired of trying to mediate a situation they didn't fully understand. Either way, the silence was a relief. Without the constant barrage of outside opinions, I could focus on what really mattered, rebuilding my life on my own terms. It wasn't easy, but each day I felt a little stronger, a little more sure of who I was and what I wanted. I threw myself into work, taking on projects that pushed me out of my comfort zone. I started picking up old hobbies I'd set aside, things that reminded me of who I used to be before everything became about keeping her happy. And slowly, the weight of her words began to lift. I stopped replaying old arguments, stopped worrying about what she might be telling other people. The more time passed, the more I realized that her version of me didn't matter. I knew the truth. That was enough. But even as I moved forward, I couldn't entirely shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting for her next move. I knew her well enough to know that she wouldn't give up that easily. She'd find another angle, another way to try and regain control. Maybe she'd reach out through someone I hadn't expected. Or maybe she'd show up in person, trying to confront me directly. The thought lingered in the back of my mind, a low hum of unease that never fully went away. I wasn't afraid of her, I knew I could stand my ground, but I couldn't deny the toll it had taken. Even now, as I built my new life, there was a part of me that remained on guard, waiting for the next shoe to drop. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. I'd lived through years of her subtle manipulation, her calculated remarks, her ability to twist the truth to suit her narrative. I knew what she was capable of. And I knew that if she tried again, I'd be ready. Because for the first time in years, I was free. Free to make my own choices, free to define myself on my own terms, and free from the weight of her expectations. It wasn't a perfect freedom, there were still scars, still moments of doubt, but it was mine. And that made all the difference. It's strange how, no matter how much distance you put between yourself and someone like Madeline, they still find ways to invade your space. After the calls and messages from mutual friends dwindled, I thought I might finally have some peace. But then, out of nowhere, she started showing up in person. The first time it happened, I was at a coffee shop a few miles from my apartment. One of those places where I like to sit in the corner, sip a cup of black coffee, and lose myself in a book. It was a quiet spot, a place that felt safe until she walked in. I didn't see her at first. I was focused on the pages in front of me, my mind somewhere far away. But then I caught the faint sound of heels on tile, a rhythm I recognized all too well. I looked up, and there she was, standing by the counter, scanning the room. When her eyes locked on mine, I felt a jolt of something between anger and dread. She smiled, a sharp, deliberate smile that I knew wasn't meant to be friendly. It was a challenge. She wasn't here to talk. She was here to remind me that I could never fully escape her. She ordered a drink and walked straight over to my table, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "Fancy seeing you here," she said, her tone light, as if this was just a chance encounter and not the calculated move it obviously was. I set my book down and looked at her, keeping my face as neutral as I could. "What do you want, Madeline?" I asked. Her smile widened. "Can't I just say hello?" She leaned back in the chair, crossing her legs, her eyes never leaving mine. I could see the satisfaction in her expression. She loved this, loved making me uncomfortable. Loved knowing that she still had the power to ruin a quiet afternoon. "You've been ignoring me," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I was starting to think you'd fallen off the face of the earth." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, waiting for her to get to the point. She didn't like that. Her smile faltered for a split second before she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a quieter, more controlled tone. "You know, it's not very mature to just block someone without an explanation. Don't you think you owe me at least a conversation?" I shook my head. "No, Madeline. I don't owe you anything." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. She wasn't used to being dismissed like that. For years, I had always been the one to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to make sure she got what she wanted. Now, I was the one drawing the line, and she didn't know how to handle it. "You're not going to get away with this," she said. Finally, her voice low and sharp. "You think you can just walk away and leave everything behind, but it doesn't work that way." I stood up, grabbing my book and my coffee. "I already did," I said, my voice calm. "And you showing up here isn't going to change that." I walked away without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. She stayed in that chair, staring after me, probably planning her next move. I knew this wasn't the end of it. Madeline never played fair, and she wasn't going to let me go without a fight. Over the next few weeks, it seemed like she was everywhere. I'd go to the grocery store and see her in the produce aisle, casually inspecting a head of lettuce, as if she just happened to be shopping at the same time. I'd stop by the gym after work, only to find her sitting on a bench near the entrance, scrolling through her phone. She never made a scene, never approached me directly, but she always made sure I knew she was there. It was a subtle kind of harassment, just enough to keep me on edge. Every time I saw her, That old knot in my stomach would tighten, and I'd have to remind myself not to let her get to me. She wanted a reaction, wanted me to acknowledge her presence, to engage with her. But I refused. I'd nod politely if our eyes met, then go about my business as if she didn't exist. It wasn't easy. Each encounter left me feeling drained, like I was constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next time she'd appear. It felt like a game, one she was determined to win. But I wasn't playing. Not anymore. One evening, as I was heading home, I noticed her car parked outside my building. She was sitting behind the wheel, her face illuminated by the soft glow of her phone screen. My first instinct was to keep driving, to avoid another confrontation. But something inside me snapped. I pulled into my usual spot and got out of the car, walking straight toward her. I tapped on her window, and she rolled it down slowly, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing here, Madeline?" I asked, my voice steady. She shrugged, her tone casual. "Just wanted to talk." I took a deep breath, my patience wearing thin. "We've already talked. You need to move on." Her eyes flickered, a mix of anger, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "It's not that simple," she said quietly. I leaned down, looking her directly in the eye. "Yes, it is. You can keep showing up, keep trying to get my attention, but it's not going to work. I'm done." She didn't say anything, just stared at me for a long moment before rolling up the window and driving away. I stood there, watching her car disappear down the street, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. It was the first time I had confronted her directly, and though it didn't feel like a victory, it felt like a step forward. After that, the appearances stopped. At least, they stopped being so obvious. I didn't see her at the grocery store or the gym anymore, and her car was nowhere near my apartment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. It was like living under a low-level threat, always bracing for the next time she'd find a way back into my life. I tried not to let it consume me. I focused on work, on the small joys of everyday life, on rebuilding the parts of myself that had been broken down over the years. But no matter how much progress I made, there was always a part of me that stayed on guard. Madeline was a storm I couldn't outrun. I could only hope that, eventually, she would grow tired of the chase and let me live my life in peace. Until then, all I could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time. I didn't expect to see her again, not like that. Not when I was finally starting to feel like I could breathe again. It happened on a Wednesday evening, just as the sun was sinking low, painting the city in shades of amber and gold. I'd left work a bit later than usual, caught up in a flurry of last-minute emails and client calls. My mind was still on the final details of a deal I'd closed that morning, the kind of success I used to dream about. But when I stepped out of the office and onto the sidewalk, I froze. There she was, leaning against my car like she belonged there, as if this were some casual meeting and not the ambush it clearly was. I felt my stomach tighten, my heart pound against my ribs. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, and gave me that familiar smile, the one that always seemed to carry more threat than warmth. "Jonathan," she said, drawing out my name as if it were some kind of invitation. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my expression as neutral as I could. "What are you doing here, Madeline?" I asked, my voice steady. Her smile widened. "Just thought we could talk. I figured you'd be done with work around now." I clenched my jaw, unwilling to let her see how much her presence still rattled me. "How did you even know I'd be here?" I asked. She laughed lightly, a sound that once might have seemed charming, but now felt like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, come on, John. It's not like you're hard to find. You've always been so predictable." That comment hit me harder than I wanted to admit, and she knew it. She always knew exactly where to poke, where to press, to get under my skin. "I don't have time for this," I said, moving past her toward the driver's side door. But she stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Please, John," she said, her tone softening. "Just give me 5 minutes." I looked at her, trying to gauge what game she was playing this time. She must have sensed my hesitation, because she quickly added, "I promise, I'll leave after that. I need to say a few things. Then you can go back to pretending I don't exist." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe I just wanted to get this over with, but I nodded. 5 minutes, I said. That's all you're getting. She stepped back, motioning toward a nearby bench. Why don't we sit down? She suggested. I followed her to the bench, keeping a good distance between us. She sat down, smoothing her skirt, and looked at me with an expression that seemed almost genuine. Almost. I know you hate me right now, she began, and I don't blame you. I said and did a lot of things I regret. I crossed my arms, waiting for her to get to the point. But you have to understand, she continued, I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how to handle what was happening between us. What was happening? I repeated, my voice flat. You mean the years of you tearing me down, treating me like I was less than nothing? She flinched at that, but quickly recovered. I know I wasn't fair to you, she admitted. I took out my frustrations on you, and I shouldn't have. I thought I was helping you by pushing you, by trying to make you better. But I see now that I went about it all wrong. I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. You weren't trying to help me, Madeline. You were trying to control me. You wanted me to fit into this version of a husband you had in your head, and when I didn't measure up, you decided I wasn't good enough. She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. I didn't mean to make you feel that way, she said softly. I thought I was being supportive, but I realize now that I was just wrong. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something real in her eyes, remorse, maybe. But then it was gone, replaced by that familiar calculating look. I just want to make things right, she said. I know I can't undo the past, but I want us to find a way forward. I stared at her, trying to see past the carefully chosen words and into whatever motives lay beneath. I had spent years believing her apologies, her promises that things would change, only to end up in the same toxic cycle. I wasn't going to fall for it again. There is no way forward, I said finally. Not for us. Her face fell, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely at a loss. So that's it? She asked. You're just giving up on everything we built together? What we built? I repeated. Madeline, I built my career, my life, my success, all of it on my own. You didn't help me. You just made me feel like I was never enough. And now that I'm finally standing on my own, you can't stand it. She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up a hand. I'm done talking, I said firmly. I gave you your 5 minutes, now you need to leave. She stared at me, her expression a mix of shock and anger. For a moment, I thought she might push back, might try to drag the conversation out further. But then she stood, brushing off her skirt, and nodded. Fine, she said, her voice cold. I'll go. But don't think this is over. I watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the pavement, and felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion wash over me. It wasn't over, I knew that. With someone like Madeline, it was never really over. But at least for now, I had made it clear that I wasn't going to be pulled back into her games. I wasn't going to let her control the narrative anymore. I wasn't going to let her control me. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand, and for the first time in years, I felt free. After that confrontation at the bench, I thought she'd back off at least for a while. I had made my stance clear. There was nothing left to say, and honestly, I felt like I could finally put that chapter behind me. But of course, that wasn't the end. Madeline wasn't one to take rejection quietly. A few days later, as I pulled into the parking lot outside my office, I saw her car again. This time, she was sitting inside, her head down, staring at her phone. I sat in my own car for a moment, just watching her. I had this fleeting hope that maybe she was just waiting for someone else. Maybe this was just a coincidence. But then she looked up and spotted me. Her face lit up, not in a warm, welcoming way, but in that same unnerving, calculated manner that always made my stomach churn. I clenched the steering wheel, willing myself to stay calm. I could feel my pulse quicken, a knot forming in my chest. This was supposed to be my space, my routine, my refuge from all the chaos she'd created. Now, here she was, invading it once again. I took a deep breath, grabbed my briefcase, and stepped out of the car. She got out too, her heels clicking on the pavement, and walked toward me like she had every right to be there. John, she said, her voice dripping with a mix of faux concern and exasperation. Can we just talk for a minute? I didn't stop walking. We already talked, I said flatly. There's nothing more to say. Come on, she pressed, falling into step beside me. You can't just keep ignoring me. I reached the door to the building and swiped my badge, ignoring her as the lock clicked open. But before I could step inside, she grabbed my arm. Don't do this, John, she said, her voice low. You know this isn't how it's supposed to be. I turned to face her, shaking her hand off. Madeline, I said firmly, this is exactly how it's supposed to be. You don't control me anymore. You don't get to show up uninvited and demand my attention. I'm done. Her eyes flashed, and for a split second, I saw the anger she was trying to hide. She stepped back, her face hardening. Fine, she said. But don't think you can just erase everything we had. You can't just walk away and pretend like none of it mattered. I opened the door and walked through, letting it close behind me without another word. As I made my way to the elevator, I could still feel the tension in my shoulders. It wasn't just her words that rattled me, it was the way she still seemed so convinced that I belonged to her, that I owed her something. It took me the entire ride up to my office to calm down. By the time I reached my desk, I had managed to push the encounter out of my mind. But as I sat down and opened my laptop, a nagging thought crept in. She wasn't going to stop. I could block her calls, delete her emails, and walk away from her attempts to confront me in person. But deep down, I knew that Madeline wouldn't just fade into the background. She'd keep pushing, keep trying to insert herself into my life. It was her way of maintaining control. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. This wasn't the life I wanted. I had worked too hard to break free, to rebuild myself, to let her drag me back into that mess. But I couldn't shake the feeling that as long as she was out there, as long as she was trying to find a way back in, I would never truly be free. It didn't happen all at once, closure never does. At first, there was this heavy weight, a gnawing tension that followed me everywhere. I thought leaving Madeline would be the end of it. I thought finally cutting those ties would bring the peace I'd been chasing for years. But walking away was only the beginning. At work, I could keep my head down, bury myself in projects, and pretend none of it had happened. My coworkers didn't know the full story. They just saw the same steady, reliable Jonathan. And for the most part, I let them believe that. I'd stay late in the evenings, volunteering to handle tasks that no one else wanted. I thought if I worked hard enough, I'd leave no room for those thoughts to creep in, the ones that questioned if I'd made the right choice. I wanted to be proud of myself, to feel strong for finally standing up to her. But pride doesn't come easy when you're trying to rebuild something that never felt solid to begin with. There were nights when I'd get home, sit on the edge of my bed, and stare at my hands like they belonged to someone else. It wasn't regret, not exactly, but more a quiet grief for the years I couldn't get back. I had spent so much time making her comfortable, making her happy, or trying to, and when I finally realized it was never going to be enough, it left this echo. Like a hollowed out space where something used to be. I hated it, that emptiness. So I kept pushing forward, hoping that one day I'd wake up and it would just be gone. But life doesn't give you neat, tidy endings. Madeline's shadow still lingered. I didn't hear from her directly anymore, not after that last confrontation outside my office, but her presence was everywhere. Mutual friends would mention her in passing, their voices dipping into that careful tone people use when they know they're stepping on a landmine. I ran into Madeline the other day, one friend said during a group dinner. She seems different. Different. I bit down hard on my tongue, holding back the sharp remark that wanted to escape. Oh? I said, keeping my voice even. How so? My friend shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. I don't know. Just quieter. Not herself. I nodded, taking a sip of my drink. People change, I guess. That ended the conversation, but it didn't end the way her name clung to the air afterward. I couldn't escape it. Even when I wasn't hearing about her, I'd catch glimpses of her on social media through mutual connections. Those carefully curated posts that made it seem like she was thriving. At first, I tried to ignore them. I told myself that her life was her business, that it didn't matter what image she put out there. But I'd still feel that tightening in my chest whenever I saw a new picture, some caption about healing or new beginnings. It felt fake, and worse, it felt like a jab, like she was trying to rewrite the narrative again. The rational part of me knew I shouldn't care, but there's a difference between what you know and what you feel, and I hated how much power she still had over my thoughts. I started seeing a therapist. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do. But after one too many nights of sitting alone in that hollow silence, I figured I had to try something. The first session was uncomfortable, me sitting there, stumbling over my words, trying to explain years of resentment and disappointment without sounding like I was just bitter. But the therapist didn't judge. She listened, and then she asked questions that hit me harder than I expected. "When you think about Madeline," she asked, "what's the first thing that comes to mind?" I blinked, taken aback. I hadn't been ready for that kind of directness. "Anger," I said finally. She nodded, waiting for me to continue. "She took so much from me," I went on, my voice low. "My confidence, my sense of self-worth. I don't even know who I am anymore. I feel like I spent all these years trying to be what she wanted, and now that she's gone, I don't know what's left." The therapist nodded again. "That's a lot to unpack," she said gently. "But the fact that you're here, talking about it, is a good start." It wasn't a magic fix, but it gave me a space to sort through the chaos in my head. Slowly, over the course of several sessions, I started to untangle those feelings. The anger didn't go away entirely, but it softened. I began to see the situation more clearly, not as a failure on my part, but as a toxic relationship I had to escape in order to find myself again. With time, I started to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but I began to focus on what made me happy, on what I wanted out of life. I reconnected with old hobbies, things I'd abandoned, because she didn't approve of them, or because I didn't have the energy to fight about it. I picked up my guitar again, just sitting in my living room, and playing until my fingers ached. I started running in the mornings, something I hadn't done in years, finding solace in the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. I even started dating again. It wasn't serious at first, just casual conversations, coffee dates that didn't go anywhere. But each time, I felt a little more like myself, a little more confident in who I was and what I had to offer. I wasn't looking for a replacement, wasn't trying to fill the void. I was just learning how to be me again, how to trust myself, how to let someone in without losing my own sense of identity. There were still hard days, of course. Days when a memory would catch me off guard, or when I'd see something that reminded me of the life I'd left behind. But those moments became less frequent, less painful, and slowly, the weight on my chest began to lift. I started to realize that Madeline didn't define me. She didn't get to control my story anymore, I did. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. So, what do you think? Was her downfall deserved, or was it too harsh? Let me know in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next shocking twist. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming up. This is just the beginning of a story you'll never forget. Standing up for yourself is never easy, but it's essential. I let years slip by trying to meet someone else's expectations, sacrificing my own happiness in the process. Looking back, I see that I deserve better. Respect, trust, and love shouldn't be earned by proving your worth. They should be freely given. It's a reminder to everyone: know your value, demand respect, and never stay in a situation that breaks you down. Life's too short to let someone else control your narrative. Take that step forward, no matter how hard it seems. You deserve to live on your own terms.